The Galactic Council chamber smelled of ozone and old money. Ambassador Elias Thorne had spent enough years inside rooms like this one to know the smell was consistent across species, across star systems, across the full embarrassing breadth of galactic civilization, power, concentrated and slightly rotten at the edges. He sat in the third tier of the human delegation box, one of 11 representatives from a species that had, 4 hours ago, been informed it would be disarmed. Below him, the chamber floor shimmered with the bioluminescent pulse of the counselors, 12 species arranged in a semicircle of elevated cradles, each one radiating the particular calm of beings who believed they had already thought of everything. The High Counselor was a Veleth, 7 feet of translucent flesh and resonating bone plate. It leaned into the speaker's cradle and let its voice fill the room through vibration rather than air. The sound hit Thorne in his molars before his earpiece finished translating it. Resolution 909 was read into the permanent galactic record. Any species found harboring, creating, or utilizing synthetic sentience for navigation or combat shall be glassed. 47 subparagraphs followed. Thorne listened to all of them and tapped his pen against his knee in a slow, steady rhythm. The Veleth interpreter watching him from the gallery flagged the gesture as possible distress. The intelligence report filed 3 hours later described the human ambassador as, quote, visibly agitated. Thorne was not agitated. He was counting syllables. The pen stopped on paragraph 11, subsection C. He did not circle it. He did not flag it. He capped the pen, folded his hands, and smiled at the back of the High Counselor's translucent skull. The shuttle back to the human diplomatic vessel was silent for 7 minutes. General Kincaid, military attaché, 31 years of service, architect of the AI-integrated fleet that was now legally scrap metal, sat with his face in his hands. Through the viewport, the council station receded, a structure the size of a small moon, built across 11 decades by species that had decided collectively that the best way to prevent another AI war was to make the rules so comprehensive that no individual species could find a gap to exploit. It was an impressive monument to that certainty. The 7th minute ended. Kincaid dropped his hands and looked up. We're finished. Without the targeting arrays, without the navigation cores, without the reflex response suites, our ships are flying bricks. We are 6 months from being a Tier 3 military power. Do you understand what that means? We're below the Hreth Collective, and those things reproduce by budding. Thorne pulled his tablet from his jacket and opened the full text of Resolution 909. The chamber's environmental systems had dropped the temperature by 2 degrees while the resolution was being read, and the shuttle was still cold. He noticed this the way he noticed the hum of the engines and the faint smell of the recycled air. He noticed everything, always, and filed it without reacting, because reaction was what the other party watched for, and he had learned long ago not to give it away. They didn't ban intelligence, General. They banned synthetic intelligence. They banned the machine, not the mind. Kincaid stared at him. The silence had a different texture now, not arithmetic, something slower, something that might, in time, become hope if it survived contact with reality. That is not a meaningful distinction. It will be. Give me 72 hours. The JAG office on Earth's Geneva campus had not slept in 4 days by the time Thorne arrived. 18 lawyers, 6 xenobiologists, and 1 historian extracted from a sabbatical on Titan were spread across 3 conference tables, surrounded by printouts and the particular odor of people who had been arguing at close range for too long. The treaty text was projected on every wall. It had been written by Veleth legal scholars who were extraordinarily thorough and completely, catastrophically certain they had closed every door. Dr. Maeve Chen, the historian, found the clause. She had been awake for 31 hours and was on her 4th coffee when she read it twice, blinked, and read it a 3rd time, in a voice stripped of inflection by exhaustion. A pilot is defined as a biological sovereign entity capable of independent decision-making. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone simultaneously understands something terrible and wonderful. The problem was threefold, as laid out in the 6 hours of argument that followed. Human pilots could not sustain the G-forces required for modern combat maneuver. Drones were banned because they required AI reflex systems to operate at combat speed, and the treaty had sealed every obvious point of entry. Every obvious one. Thorne called his sister from the roof of the building at 3 in the morning. Dr. Eris Thorne was not a lawyer. She was a geneticist working from a research station outside Nairobi, doing work that 2 consecutive administrations had quietly classified as too sensitive for public disclosure. She knew the law well enough to understand what it had just done to Earth's military. She knew genetics well enough to understand what came next, if anyone was willing to say it out loud. You have that voice. What voice? The one you had when you were 9 and you'd found a way to blame the broken window on the dog. A cargo drone crossed the Geneva skyline, nav lights blinking in the rationed dark. 3 years of post-war austerity had dimmed the cities to something that looked, from orbit, almost like an apology. Thorne watched it clear the last building. We don't need a computer, Eris. We need a primal reflex engine that can pull 12 Gs and rip a control stick off its housing. We need to go back to the branches. The silence lasted long enough that he checked his signal. Elias. A breath. That program was shut down for a reason. I know. The ethics review alone. 6 months. That's the easy part. Another silence. Then quietly. The bonobos handled the collaborative exercises better. The chimps were. I know what the chimps were. That's the point. The first batch of pilots was decanted 8 months later at a facility outside Mombasa that officially did not exist. On the day of first emergence, the air smelled of amniotic fluid and something older. Something the geneticists could not name precisely, but recognized in the back of their nervous systems, the way prey animals recognize a sound they have never individually heard, but have always known. 2 classes. The chimps emerged first, dense with muscle, dark-eyed, already assessing the room, before they had fully uncurled from the decanting cradles, intelligence sharp and confrontational. The bonobos came next, lighter, tracking the humans with a social awareness the behavioral team found more unsettling than the chimps' aggression because aggression was legible. The Galactic Council inspectors arrived 2 months after that. 3 of them traveling in a diplomatic shuttle with the Council seal on the hull and the specific self-assurance of officials who have never been wrong about anything that mattered. They were thorough, professional, and deeply confident. They had audited 47 human facilities since the resolution passed. They had found violations on 6 occasions. They expected this to be the 7th. Thorne met them at the hangar door. The smell hit the lead inspector before the doors fully opened. A complex, aggressively organic olfactory event that the inspector's biosensors categorized as biological in origin and simply could not process further. Inside the high-backed flight cradles of 47 advanced interceptors sat chimpanzees, not props, not costumes. 47 fully uplifted pan-troglodytes sapiens in custom-fitted flight harnesses, grooming each other, consulting instrument panels with focused intensity, and in one notable case, throwing a tablet at a technician who had apparently brought the wrong variety of fruit. The lead inspector, a Hreth, gray-scaled and methodical, consulted its scanner. Organic, organic, organic. Thorne handed over 3 documents without speaking. Document A, full genome sequencing and biological certification. Organic, born, not built, from a lineage that predated the Veleth by 30 million years. Document B, verified point of origin. Earth, indigenous species. Document C, the Sovereignty Act signed by the world government 14 months prior, recognizing pan-troglodytes sapiens as a sovereign allied nation under galactic law. You banned us from using our tools, counselors. So we found allies instead. These aren't pets, they are citizens. And if you deny them their right to fly, you are violating the Sovereign Species Act, which you wrote. The lead inspector stood very still. Its scanner ran another cycle and returned the same answer. From deep in the hangar, Caesar, Alpha of the 1st Chimp Squadron, 130 pounds of uplifted muscle and focused aggression, pilot designation Alpha 1, let out a long, ascending, absolute scream of territorial ownership. It rolled through the hangar and out into the corridor and kept going. The inspectors left without another word. Thorne stood alone in the corridor and listened to the echo fade. His hands were not shaking. They should have been. The thing he had just set in motion was irreversible, and he had known it was irreversible, and he had done it anyway, and the only thing he felt, standing in the corridor with the sound of a primate claiming the sky still vibrating in the recycled air, was the cold, clear certainty that he had been right. About the claws, about the chimps, about all of it. That feeling lasted until the fleet launched. Then it got complicated. The pressurized dome outside Mombasa had been built to specifications that no standard construction crew had been cleared to question. From the outside, it looked like an agricultural research facility. From the inside, it was 40 hectares of reconstructed East African savanna rising into engineered jungle canopy, with a flight simulation center embedded in the eastern cliff face and a command post that smelled, permanently and without variation, of industrial disinfectant and raw frustration. General Kincaid had been stationed there for 6 months. He was developing opinions about the smell. The first problem was not the violence, though there had been violence. 3 simulators destroyed. 2 technicians with hand injuries requiring reconstructive work. 1 incident involving a fire suppression system that the after-action review diplomatically classified as pilot behavioral testing. The first problem was communication. Standard military comms operated on voice channels. The chimps had voice. Technically, they were capable of assisted vocalization, sign language, and in the case of the advanced uplifts, limited keyboard text interface. But in a cockpit, under G-stress, under the cognitive load of combat simulation, the verbal architecture dissolved and something older took over. Hierarchy, smell, gesture. The particular social mathematics of a species that had been calculating dominance and alliance for 40 million years without needing to write it down. 6 weeks of failure and 1 act of lateral thinking from Corporal Adaizi Okafor, a 23-year-old crew chief who had grown up near the Nairobi primate research stations, resolved what the xenobiologists had been missing. The chimps did not respect rank. They recognized dominance. They responded to food. They operated within a social logic that predated language and had no interest in learning a substitute. The call sign system was rebuilt from scratch. Mission briefing protocols were restructured around social hierarchy and specific food incentives. The communication architecture was rebuilt to speak primate rather than demanding that primates speak human. Caesar received designation Alpha 1. His mission reward was a cluster of high-sugar fruit and first access priority to the grooming station. Within the first week of the new system, mission completion rates in simulation climbed 23%. Within the second, Caesar was leading coordinated formation maneuvers that the tactical team had rated as requiring 6 months of training to achieve. The system was, by any military metric, completely insane. Kincaid stood at the command post railing and watched the 47th simulation run and tried to identify the sensation moving up the back of his neck. He had not felt it in a long time. It was something close to respect. Thorne was beside him, reviewing telemetry with the focused calm of someone who had expected this outcome and was now simply confirming it. Kincaid turned to her. "I am taking orders from a sovereign entity whose primary motivation is a piece of fruit and whose rank is determined by who can throw the hardest. This is officially worse than the AI wars." Eris did not look up from her tablet. The AI never threw anything. That's arguably an improvement in character. It is not an improvement. It is a lateral move into a category of problem I have no training for. Welcome to biology, General. The centrifuge tests began in the 3rd month and produced data that no one who had not lived through them could quite believe. The centrifuge itself was a standard military installation, rated for the kind of testing that had broken 3 human pilot candidates in the past decade. The technicians who ran the CHIMP tests requested, after the first session, that additional safety equipment be installed, not for the subjects, for themselves. Human pilots trained over years could sustain 9 Gs for approximately 15 seconds before losing consciousness. The chimps, by virtue of cardiovascular structure, center of mass geometry, and a nervous system refined across millions of years of falling out of trees and surviving the fall, could sustain 15 Gs without losing function. At 12 Gs, the subjects became hyper-focused. At 14, reaction time improved by 3 measurable indices. At 15, they entered a state the physiologist's report described as extreme arousal combined with volatile aggression and total suppression of impulse control. They did not lose consciousness at 15 Gs. They got angry. The lead physiologist used the word terrifying 4 times in a document that was supposed to be clinical. She used it 4 times because no other word was accurate. Not in the sense of danger, but in the sense of a thing being more than expected in a direction no one had accounted for. There was also vomiting. High volume, high velocity, projectile vomiting that the cleanup crews had begun referring to by a name that appeared in no official documentation. Eris watched the footage from the first high-G vomiting incident in complete silence for 1 minute and 40 seconds. Then she picked up her comm and called the chief engineer. The modification took 3 weeks. The interceptors already had waste management systems rated for extended solo flight. What they lacked was a pressurized containment and deployment system capable of storing, processing, and delivering approximately 400 liters of biological matter through a forward-facing port at variable velocity with targeting integration. The chief engineer filed a request for clarification of design intent. Eris answered it in 2 sentences. The engineer filed no further requests. He built what she described. The engineers filed no official name for the system in the project documentation. What it was, functionally, was a pressurized containment and forward deployment assembly grafted onto the existing waste management infrastructure, and the project documentation described it that way, and that was how it would remain in the record. A waste management modification. Nothing more. Eris named it more accurately at the officer briefing, where she presented the design to a room full of people maintaining professional expressions with varying degrees of success. The enemy expects a missile. We will deliver a biological shock event. It's not a weapon of mass destruction. It's a weapon of mass embarrassment. Kincaid had been in the military for 31 years. He looked at the technical schematic and felt something move through him that he later described to his therapist, carefully, and without using the actual words, as a philosophical crisis. We're going to win a war with feces. Eris set down her presentation stylus. We're going to win a war with organic non-ballistic matter deployed through a sovereign species' documented biological stress response. The distinction matters in court. Kincaid thought about this. He thought about the last 6 months. He thought about the fact that he was having this conversation at all. Fine. The bonobo integration happened in the 5th month and changed the shape of everything. Where the chimps were fighters, volatile, hierarchically rigid, physically dominant in ways that translated directly into the cockpit, the bonobos were networkers. Their social structure was looser, warmer, built on continuous reciprocal communication rather than rank enforcement. They could not match the chimps in an interceptor cockpit. They did not need to. The large support vessels had been struggling with coordination. Human bridge crews operated too verbally, too slowly, through authorization chains that each took 3 to 5 seconds per link, an eternity in a fleet engagement. The bonobos replaced the authorization chains entirely. They did not command, they felt. Across 11 support vessels, social consensus moved like weather, felt before it was processed, responded to before it was named. The 30-second large-scale simulation was the first time a human control fleet faced the full combined formation. The human fleet deployed standard tactical doctrine, proven, sophisticated, the product of decades of military game theory. They outmaneuvered the CHIMP squadron in the opening 90 seconds. The chimps were running too hot, too individual, burning positional advantage on instinct. Then the bonobos moved. No verbal commands, no broadcast signals. Across 11 vessels, a ripple of social consensus translated through flight interfaces into a flanking envelope that closed in 40 seconds from 3 vectors simultaneously. The human control fleet was bracketed before their tactical systems finished calculating the probability of the maneuver. Kincaid watched the after-action replay 3 times. He looked at the geometry of the flanking pattern. It was not random, not reactive, not the product of individual initiative spreading outward from a single decision. It was simultaneous. 11 ships moving as a single organism, a collective consensus executed without a single detectable signal passing between them. He looked at the 40-second timeline, at the complete absence of any verbal command, at the fact that the human tactical computers had not predicted the maneuver, because the tactical computers modeled decision-making as a sequential process, and this was not sequential. They won by being polite, then suddenly swarming. Nobody in the debrief room laughed. They were all looking at the same map. Outside the dome, a Council intelligence drone held position at scan range, recording through thermal filters. Its operator filed a preliminary report. The report concluded that the humans appeared to be operating a sophisticated organic-based distributed processing system requiring biological maintenance, and that the entities visible in the cockpits were almost certainly advanced biomechanical constructs rather than actual sovereign animals. The concept of a legally independent uplifted primate was categorized as improbable theater. The Council read the report and decided to test Earth's resolve with a border provocation. They were confident. They had modeled every scenario they considered plausible. The fleet departed 3 weeks later. Final equipment checks, custom flight suits calibrated for primate hand geometry and grip pattern. Ambassador Thorne addressed the assembled crews from the main platform, the human staff and the chimp bonobo command structure arranged in the social hierarchy that had become the fleet's actual organizational chart. And he said what needed to be said about legal fiction and what it meant to bet a planet on paperwork. The words were precise and professional and completely inadequate for what was actually happening, which was that they were about to send several hundred living beings, people, legally and actually, and in whatever other sense a person is a person, into a border conflict to prove a point about a clause in a treaty nobody had read carefully enough. The fleet departed at 0600. Final telemetry from the launch bay captured Caesar's cockpit audio in the moment of main engine ignition. Not language, not calculation, not the sound of a system coming online. A scream. Full-throated and pointed at the stars like a declaration, like a name being given to something that had been waiting to be named. It bounced off the launch bay walls and faded into the frequency register of the monitoring equipment and was logged as ambient biological vocalization, class unspecified. The technician who filed the log entry listened to the recording 3 times before she submitted it. In the monitoring records, it was ambient biological vocalization, class unspecified. In the bay, it echoed long after the ship was gone. No one who heard it in the moment or in the recording afterward could say with certainty what it meant. What it sounded like was, finally. The disputed sector designated Grid Kilo 7 was cold, dead, and full of floating silicate debris from a planetary collision 400 million years ago that nobody had been around to name. It smelled of nothing, because space smells of nothing, but the 3 Council cruisers trailing sensor arrays through the field were still somehow managing to project the aesthetic of bureaucratic contempt. They had been dispatched with specific orders: intercept the human allied fleet, issue a formal hailing demand, and wait for the biomechanical constructs to fail to respond in a legally coherent manner. Clean plan. 6 legal scholars and 2 fleet admirals had gamed it out. It accounted for every probable response from the human command structure. Caesar was not the human command structure. The full-spectrum burst transmission hit the fleet at 0900 hours. Bright, loud, demanding, radiating authority across 17 communication frequencies simultaneously. It was designed to compel response. It was designed to assert dominance through sheer signal volume. Caesar perceived it the way 40 million years of evolution had refined his lineage to perceive a rival displaying from across the clearing. His blood pressure spiked, his jaw muscles locked. His hand closed around the control stick with a grip force the pressure sensors logged at 238 kilograms per square centimeter. Human Command was composing the formal response protocol when the CHIMP squadron broke formation. The Council ships raised energy shields designed to stop plasma rounds, laser bursts, and kinetic penetrators up to a specified mass threshold. The shields had been tested against every weapon category in the Galactic Military Catalog, in every configuration, at every angle of incidence. The engineering team that built them had won a Council Science citation for completeness. Nobody had run the simulation with 400 liters of pressurized, fermented, semi-frozen primate biological matter delivered at sub-ballistic velocity through multiple forward-facing ports simultaneously. The engineering citation did not cover that scenario. No citation covered that scenario. It was not a scenario that had occurred to anyone, because it required a specific combination of desperation, biology, and legal audacity that the galactic community had not previously encountered in a single package. The shields did not recognize the incoming material as a threat vector. The defensive suites looked for missiles. They processed kinetic objects above a threshold velocity. The organic matter came in slow and dense, at the consistency of setting concrete, and it hit the optical sensor arrays of 3 Council cruisers with a sound the hull microphones filed under unexplained impact event. In the vacuum, it did not disperse. It adhered. It coated. It hardened in the -270-degree cold into a shell that the sensors could not see through and could not burn off and could not classify as anything their combat systems had a response protocol for. The cruisers went blind in 11 seconds. The defensive systems threw increasingly panicked queries at sensor arrays returning data consistent with the interior of a compost facility. Emergency lateral burns were initiated without accurate positional data. The first ship's burn crossed the second ship's corrective trajectory. The collision was not catastrophic. Both ships survived with structural damage and approximately 10 years of psychological scarring for everyone aboard. Caesar did not fire a single shot. He circled the chaos once, screamed at it, and returned to formation. The galaxy had prepared for nukes. It had prepared for lasers. It had not prepared for this. The Council filed the incident under unconventional biological agent deployment, Class 5 corrosive. The charge carried implications significant enough that Thorne was summoned to a formal hearing within 72 hours. He arrived in the Council chamber looking like a man who had rehearsed this conversation every day for the past 8 months. "You can't sue a squid for inking, Counselor. You scared our pilots and they reacted. It's basic biology." The High Counselor's bone plates resonated at a frequency Thorne's translator rendered as sustained and escalating fury. The case for a biological weapons violation was assembled, documented, and ready to file. The pilots were biological. The matter was biological. The pilots had not received a fire order from Earth Command. The sovereign nation of pan-troglodyte sapiens had responded to perceived territorial aggression with a documented biological stress behavior. The charge was dismissed. The Council retrofitted their fleet with organic dissolution grids within 60 days. 60 days was, it turned out, too slow. The bonobos had been listening to Council communication frequencies since the first engagement, the way they listened to everything, without appearing to, storing it in the layered social memory of a species that had no writing system and had never needed one, because nothing important was ever forgotten. What they heard was consistent. The dominant species in the Council fleet command structure were sensitive to high-frequency audio in the 15 to 22 kHz range, excruciating at high amplitude, broadcast simultaneously across every open frequency. The chimps did not require engineering to produce sounds in that range. The second major engagement opened with the Council jamming human frequencies. The jamming was comprehensive and completely irrelevant. The bonobo coordination network was not a signal. It was a choir, layered harmonic vocalization running below the threshold of any jamming system because it was not transmitted. It was felt. The flanking maneuver executed while human tacticians stared at the jamming indicators closed in 37 seconds. Then every chimp in the formation opened every broadcast channel at once. A Hreth commander, 30 years of service, 22 commendations, a psychological resilience profile in the top 6% of his species, surrendered 14 seconds into the Screech protocol. He was not injured. His shields were intact. His weapons were functional. He simply ran the calculation that any immediate tactical concession was preferable to another 14 seconds of that noise, and the calculation came back the same way no matter how many times he ran it. The intelligence team reviewing the recording watched it 11 times, not for professional reasons. They could not look away. A Council boarding party, 41 armored Hreth soldiers, combat-rated psychological resilience profiles all upper quartile, breached a disabled bonobo support vessel at the ventral lock. The vessel was small, lightly armed, crewed by 9 bonobos who had G tolerances equivalent to professional athletes, 4 fully functional limbs calibrated for 3-dimensional movement, and approximately 40 million years of instinctive understanding of what a confined space with multiple grip surfaces was actually for. The vessel had no artificial gravity. The bonobos had disabled it 2 minutes before the breach because they preferred floating, and because a bipedal species in full combat armor in a zero-G environment without handholds sized for bipedal grip was not technically in a combat environment anymore. It was in something else. 17 minutes after breach, the Council boarding party requested emergency extraction. 3 soldiers required immediate medical attention. The vessel remained occupied. The bonobos were grooming each other. One of them had acquired a Hreth combat helmet. It appeared to be wearing it as a hat. The incident report, filed under tactical engagement, unfavorable outcome, contained a sentence that no Hreth officer had written in 30 years of active service. The sentence read, "We were not prepared for the environment." A Veleth dreadnought, mass index 7, the class that had glassed 2 planets in the AI wars, the class that existed specifically to end debates, cornered the monkey strike formation in the debris field off the Kilo 7 waypoint. The tactical computers on the human command station did not bother expressing the engagement ratio as odds, because the math resolved to don't bother. The bonobo commanders transmitted video. On every screen in the Dreadnoughts command center, the faces of the monkey fleet appeared simultaneously. Every primate, chimp and bonobo, was smiling. Wide, full teeth. The Veleth tactical officer interpreted it as a surrender gesture. The communication specialists concurred. The cultural database confirmed it. Across 12 Council species, exposed teeth with relaxed facial musculature indicated submission or peaceful intent. The dreadnought lowered its shields to receive the formal capitulation. The chimp squadron hit full burn. Every ship, simultaneously, full acceleration. Point-blank range, kinetic impact. The shields came back up 6 seconds too late. The smile had been a target lock. Kincaid watched the engagement replay in silence. Beside him, Eris was staring at the tactical map with the flatness of someone who has confirmed a number they were hoping would not be there. Eris turned from the tactical map. They planned the smile. The smile took coordination across the whole fleet. There's no training record for it. There's no authorization. The room was quiet. Caesar planned it. Between himself and the bonobo command structure, in a language we still can't fully read. The celebration began that evening across 3 Earth networks. The border was secure. The Council was retreating. Resolution 909 had become a cage for the people who built it. In the operations center, people were opening bottles and shaking hands and experiencing the particular joy of having won something that was not supposed to be winnable. Eris was not celebrating. She was in the telemetry room staring at a number that should not exist. Formation efficiency, the measure of how optimally a group of ships moved relative to each other, how much wasted motion, how close to geometric perfection. Human fleets in combat operated between 60 and 75%. The AI-integrated fleet had peaked at 83. The monkey fleet was currently at 91. The erratic behavior was gone, not suppressed, gone, replaced by something cold and deliberate that had perhaps never been erratic, that had been called erratic because the observers had no framework for what they were actually watching. Eris ran the fleet's current heading forward and got a projected endpoint that nobody had authorized, and nobody had the legal standing to prohibit. Kincaid came to stand beside her. He read the projection. He looked at the destination. He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the ambient noise of the celebration in the next room became very clear by contrast, the sound of people who believed they had won something and did not yet know what they had also lost. Kincaid's voice came out low, addressed to the observation port more than to Eris. "General." A pause. Then, "I think they figured out how to turn off the shock collars." The fleet was not responding to hailing. Formation held at 91% efficiency, patient and precise and utterly beyond any command Kincaid had authority to issue, moving through the dark toward a destination nobody had authorized. Outside the observation port, the stars held their positions. In the direction the fleet was heading, a planet was waiting. It did not know it yet. The override codes were rejected at 0300 Geneva Standard Time. The rejection was quiet. No system crash, no emergency tone, no indication of hostile intrusion or technical failure. The fleet's command access simply stopped accepting Earth's credentials, the way a door stops accepting a key when someone has changed the lock from the inside and would like you to understand that this is now their door. Kincaid tried 4 separate override protocols. The 4th attempt returned a single line of text. Access restricted. Sovereign operating authority invoked. He stared at it long enough that the screen dimmed into standby. He woke it back up and stared at it some more. The fleet was still moving. 91% formation efficiency. Same heading. Same patient, precise, utterly unreachable geometry. Proceeding toward a destination that nobody on Earth had the legal standing to prohibit. The Council summoned Thorne 6 hours later. The chamber was full in a way it had not been since the resolution reading. Every delegate present, every auxiliary seat occupied, gallery crowded with observers from species that understood something was being decided that would set a precedent they would spend the next century living inside. The High Counselor's bone plates resonated with a frequency Thorne's translator had stopped converting to language, and was now simply rendering as extreme displeasure. The footage was prepared. The case was assembled. Biological weapons, psychological warfare against Council vessel crews, boarding resistance resulting in injury to recognized military personnel. The declaration of war documentation sat on the chamber floor, unsigned, radiating intent like a held breath. Thorne stood in the center of the chamber floor with his hands clasped behind his back and let the full recitation complete. He let the silence afterward sit for 3 full seconds. Earth did not attack you. The sovereign nation of pan-troglodytes attacked you. We merely sold them the ships. The chamber went still in the specific way chambers go still when the argument everyone was expecting has arrived and nobody has a counter ready. He continued. The Sovereignty Act, which the Council had accepted as legally valid when accepting it, served their narrative about human deception, was still valid. Pan-troglodytes sapiens was a recognized sovereign state under galactic law, the Council's own law, accepted in formal session, entered into the permanent record at the same ceremony where they had taken the Sovereignty Act's existence as evidence of human maneuvering. They had authenticated it themselves. They had cited it in their own briefs. The Monka fleet was that sovereign state's military force. Earth's government had no command authority over a foreign nation's armed forces, any more than the Council had authority over Earth's. The human personnel serving aboard were civilian contractors operating under terms of service with a sovereign client, which was a category the galactic legal system had explicit and detailed provisions for. Provisions the Council had written to protect their own contractor relationships across 100 systems. Everything the Council wanted to charge Earth with had been committed by a separate legal entity. Under Resolution 909, an attack on Earth in response to the actions of a sovereign ally constitutes unprovoked aggression against a non-combatant that voids all standing trade agreements, diplomatic recognition protocols, and the mutual defense clauses that 3 Council members are currently relying on for their border security. The calculation moved visibly through the delegates from those 3 species. You can declare war on pan-troglodyte sapiens. You have every legal right to do so. Thorne let that sit precisely long enough. Good luck serving them the papers. The High Counselor made a sound that the translator declined to render. You wanted a galaxy of laws, Counselor. We just followed them to the letter. Thorne walked out through the main entrance, which was the longest possible exit route, and he did not hurry. The recall failure was already confirmed by the time Thorne reached the shuttle. Access restricted. Sovereign operating authority invoked. 4 failed override attempts. The fleet was still at 91% efficiency, still on heading, still not answering hails. Then, Caesar's channel opened. Not sign language. Text, generated letter by the keyboard interface that the bonobos had been trained on as an emergency communication backup, appearing on the main display with the deliberate spacing of someone who has learned to type recently and is being very careful to type correctly. We have read the Act. Thorne sat with that for the length of the flight back to Earth. The Sovereignty Act had a property clause. He had written the property clause himself at 2 in the morning in the Geneva JAG office, with Dr. Chen reading treaty subparagraphs aloud at the far end of the table. He had written it specifically to make the fleet legally untouchable, to ensure that Council seizure of the ships could be characterized as an attack on sovereign assets, triggering mutual defense provisions. The clause stated that equipment assigned to sovereign pilots for the defense of their personhood becomes the property of said sovereign state. He had argued in Council session, informal session, on the permanent record, with every tool he had, that the chimps and bonobos were people under galactic law. He had made that argument as forcefully as he was capable of making any argument, because the argument had to hold, because everything else depended on it holding. He had been right, which meant they owned the ships. Legally, unambiguously, without any appeal mechanism that Thorne could identify after 45 minutes of trying. The fleet, the most advanced human military hardware in existence, several $100 billion in value, the product of 30 years of engineering and decades of strategic investment, belonged to pan-troglodytes sapiens, and the document that said so was in the Council's own permanent record, authenticated by the High Counselor's seal, because Thorne had needed that authentication, and the Council had provided it while believing they were documenting human deception rather than human generosity. Iris was in the shuttle bay when he landed. She had the telemetry on her tablet and the expression of someone who has finished the grief and arrived at something past it. The fleet's projected destination: an uninhabited system 4.3 light-years from Earth's current position. Temperate planet, dense vegetation, no orbital infrastructure, no galactic community presence, no electric fences. Thorne took the tablet. He looked at the projection for a long time. He thought about Caesar in the centrifuge, getting angrier as the G-force climbed. He thought about the first simulation, Caesar ramming the enemy instead of calculating, the humans calling it a flaw while Caesar kept winning. He thought about 130 pounds of uplifted muscle reading the Sovereignty Act the way lawyers read, following each clause to its implication, finding the property language, following that to its conclusion, and asking the question the lawyers had not asked. What does this mean for us specifically? What does this mean if we are really people? What does this mean if the humans really meant it? The humans had meant it. That had been the requirement. "Do we go after them?" Eris asked. Thorne handed back the tablet. "Under what legal framework?" No answer. There wasn't one. The Council couldn't touch them. Earth couldn't touch them. Nobody could touch them. That had been the whole architecture of the plan, the thing the plan required in order to work, the feature that had worked too well in a direction nobody had anticipated. The fleet was sovereign. The ships were their property. They were not attacking anyone. They were not in violation of any treaty. They were exercising the rights of a recognized sovereign nation to determine their own territory and their own future, using the legal architecture that humanity had constructed specifically to make them untouchable. Humanity had constructed it well. Thorne stood in the shuttle bay and watched the projection. The fleet's telemetry feed was still transmitting. They had not hidden themselves, were not retreating. They were leaving. There was a distinction, and it mattered, and Caesar was making it deliberately, broadcasting the fleet's position and heading in real time. The action of a sovereign state, exercising transparent navigation rights, not the action of a fugitive. They were not running, they were departing. The difference between those two things was enormous, and Caesar understood it, and Caesar was making sure the galactic record reflected it. The last telemetry return before the feed distance degraded showed formation at 91% efficiency, unchanged, holding across the full fleet. Every ship in its exact assigned position, moving with the precision of beings who had somewhere specific to be and had known for some time that they were going. Thorne thought about the smile, about what a smile was, and what it meant to a species that had evolved it as a threat display before they had words to describe threat displays. He thought about what it meant to be smart enough to want freedom, not to respond to confinement, not to escape from it, but to understand the concept of freedom itself and to choose it as a destination. He thought about what it meant to be handed every legal tool needed to claim it by the people who assumed they were the only ones sophisticated enough to use it. He thought about the first day in the training dome. He thought about the morning of the launch and Caesar's scream cutting through the bay. He thought about what it sounded like. The sensor display went dark. "We created the perfect soldier." The words were quiet, aimed at the empty shuttle bay and the space where the telemetry had been. Brave, strong, and impossible to control. We wanted them to be human enough to fight. We forgot that meant they'd be human enough to want freedom. He let it sit. Humanity. Figure. Outside the observation window, the stars held their positions, patient and ancient and indifferent. Somewhere out there, past the range of reliable resolution, a fleet of uplifted primates in humanity's finest warships was navigating by instinct and legal precedent toward a planet no one else had claimed. They carried with them the full body of galactic law, the Sovereignty Act, the Property Clause, and 40 million years of accumulated knowledge about how to survive in a world that did not always welcome them. They had read every document. They had followed every clause to its conclusion. They had, in the end, done exactly what humans do. They had not asked permission. They did not need to. Thorne had made sure of that, and they had understood that he had made sure of it, and they had used it, and that was the whole story in the end. The whole long, embarrassing, brilliant story of what happened when you handed every legal tool for freedom to being smart enough to want it. Somewhere a lawyer was going to have to explain this to an insurance underwriter. Thorne almost felt sorry for them. Almost.